90 pounds of Dutch Shepherd cleared the intake desk in under 4 seconds, and every person in Palomar Animal Emergency either backed into a wall or grabbed something to hold on to. His name was Grit. It was on the vest that was half torn off his chest, black lettering, San Diego PD K9, unit number worn down from years of use. He was 8 years old, and, according to the officer who'd brought him in, a sergeant named Kirk Bauer with a gash across his forearm and the face of someone who hadn't slept in 36 hours, he'd been like this since the incident. That was the word Bauer kept using. The incident. Like there was a category for what Grit had become in the last 4 hours, and the category had a polite name. There wasn't one. Grit was 90 pounds of muscle and teeth, and something that had been building for a long time. And he moved like a system that had finally stopped tolerating what it had been asked to carry. He'd already knocked the intake tech, Theo, sideways into the supply cart. He'd sent an IV pole clattering across the tile. 2 technicians had retreated to the hallway doorway and stood there watching with the particular stillness of people who understood that moving was going to make this worse. Bauer had both hands wrapped in the leash, pulling from the shoulder the way handlers did when they'd been trained properly, which meant this wasn't a leash problem and wasn't a training failure. This was something else. Sadie Collum was at the far end of the intake counter, finishing a notation in a post-surgical chart when Grit came through the door. She didn't back up, she watched. His movement was wrong. Not wrong like uncontrolled, wrong like compensated. His hindquarters were doing something subtle, a micro-adjustment in how he distributed his weight with each stride, and you wouldn't catch it unless you'd spent years watching animals who'd learned to route around pain without acknowledging it. Every aggressive lunge forward was followed by a split-second correction that happened below conscious behavior, deep in the neurology of a body that had been managing something for longer than it should have had to. She came around the counter. Dr. Renshaw's voice landed somewhere behind her. "Collum, don't." She raised one hand without turning, not at him, just hold. She stopped 10 feet from Grit and stood level, weight even, and she let him see her the way animals saw things, as a presence, not a performance. She held eye contact for 3 seconds. Then she looked away, slow, deliberate, the animal equivalent of, "I'm not here to take anything from you." Grit went still. Not calm, still. The difference between a storm ending and a storm deciding. She took a step, held position, took another. His ears tracked toward her and steadied. His breathing stayed heavy, but the rhythm changed, the short reactive bursts of aggression lengthening into something she could work with. She stopped 6 feet away and looked at him properly this time, the way you looked at something when you were reading rather than watching. She saw the way he carried the left hind leg just slightly off true. The way his lower back carried a stiffness that didn't match an acute injury. The way his pupils sat slightly wide in a manner that stress alone didn't fully account for. She pulled a piece of dried turkey from the pocket of her scrubs. She always kept it there. The attending vets thought it was excessive. She kept it anyway. She placed it on the floor and slid it toward him with the side of her foot. He looked at it. Looked at her. Back at the turkey. Then he walked to it with the measured movements of a dog that had made a provisional decision about someone and was going to honor it until proven wrong. The room let out a breath it had been holding for 4 minutes. "Get me imaging," Sadie said. "Left lumbar, hip joint, and a full tox panel." She looked at Bauer without fully turning her attention away from Grit. How long has he been favoring that leg? Bauer blinked. He was cleared for duty 6 weeks ago. "That's not what I asked." A long pause. 2 months. Maybe a little more. The unit supervisor said it was behavioral, said he was getting territorial. Sadie looked at Grit, who had pressed his nose lightly against the back of her hand. "He's in pain," she said. Not gently. Just directly, the way true things deserve to be said. "He's been in pain for a while. The aggression comes after that, not before." Palomar Animal Emergency sat on the edge of the Midway District in a building that had been a dental office before it was a trauma center, and on busy days, which was most days, because Palomar was the only Level 2 animal facility within 40 miles of the coast, Sadie Collum worked all of it simultaneously and without any particular acknowledgement from anyone who held a title. She'd been there 4 years. She was 32, medium height, dark hair she kept pinned tight at the back of her head, and she had the kind of face that people consistently read as blank when it was actually processing something at a speed they couldn't see. She didn't correct the misread. She'd stopped correcting things like that a long time ago, and she'd found, generally, that being underestimated was not always the disadvantage people assumed. Invisible people hear things. Invisible people go unguarded around. Invisible people sometimes catch what everyone else walks past. Dr. Renshaw ran the facility with the particular quality of a man who believed that authority was a substance he possessed in finite supply and that sharing it cost him something real. He summoned staff the way some people flag taxis, with expectation and without eye contact. He'd never asked Sadie a direct question in 4 years that wasn't followed immediately by telling her the answer he'd already decided on. She fixed what he sent her to fix. She did it correctly and completely. She went home on time or she didn't, depending on what was in the ward, and she never complained about which. The morning Grit came in was a Tuesday in late October, and up until 2:17 in the afternoon, it had been entirely ordinary. Renshaw wanted to sedate Grit before the exam. Sadie expected that, and she was already moving when she said no. He turned toward her with the expression of a man who had not recently been told no and found the experience genuinely novel. Collum. Sedation before blood work is a dosage problem, she said, keeping her voice level. We don't have his current weight. We don't have a tox panel, and if he's already metabolizing something, adding sedation to that mix without knowing the baseline could crash his blood pressure before we know what we're dealing with. She met Renshaw's eyes. Give me 15 minutes. If he won't tolerate it, we sedate. But let me try. Renshaw looked past her at Bauer, who was standing in the corner of the intake bay with his arms loose at his sides, and said nothing, which was its own form of answer. 15 minutes, Renshaw said. It took 20. Grit tolerated her hands the way experienced working dogs tolerated things they'd decided weren't threats, with effort and with clear signals that the effort had limits. There were 2 moments when he went rigid and his lip pulled back. Both times, Sadie stopped, waited, and the moment passed. She found it in the lumbar region, above the hip joint. Not a gunshot residue pattern, not an acute impact site, something older, a nerve compression, deep and structural, the kind that developed over months of repeated stress on a joint that had been carrying more than it should. The kind of thing that could be managed pharmacologically, muted long enough to pass a clearance exam, not long enough to heal. She worked through the location twice in her head. Then she stood and looked at Renshaw. There's nerve involvement in the lumbar sacral junction, she said. The gait compensation is chronic, not acute. Whatever happened during the incident yesterday didn't cause this. She paused. It revealed it. The clearance exam was 6 weeks ago, Bauer said from the corner. His voice had gone very quiet. People trained the way he'd been trained went quiet when they got close to something they didn't like. A thorough exam would have caught this, Sadie said. Whether it did depends on what the report says. She looked at Renshaw. I need the tox panel. The blood work came back 3 hours later, and Sadie was in the break room eating leftover rice from her lunch bag when Renshaw appeared in the doorway holding the folder with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Not quite alarm, more like a man who had been moving through a familiar hallway and discovered that the door at the end opened somewhere he hadn't expected. He put the panel results on the table without saying anything. She looked at them. Phenylbutazone, gabapentin, methocarbamol. The combination wasn't unusual in working dog pain management, which was part of why it worked. What was unusual was the dosing pattern. And what was more unusual and more specific was the half-life residue. Whatever Grit had been given, he'd been given it consistently, at maintenance levels, over an extended period, long enough that it had become part of his baseline chemistry. Long enough to quiet the nerve signals from a compressed lumbar joint during a medical clearance exam. She set the results down. She did something with her jaw that she noticed and controlled. Apex Canine Medical Services, she said. That's the clearance contractor. Renshaw looked at her. How did you know the contractor's name? She looked at the tox results instead of him. Because I've seen this before. The woman who came through Palomar's back entrance at 4:47 that afternoon had a federal ID clipped to her jacket and the particular economical stillness of someone who had been working one case for a long time and had just found the piece she'd been missing. Special Agent Lee Quirk, Department of Justice, Office of Inspector General. She asked for Sadie by name, not the intake nurse by name. Sadie came out from the post-op ward and looked at the badge and then at Quirk's face, and something that had been quietly coiling in her chest since she'd looked at Grit's talks panel 3 hours ago went still. "You've been running something," Sadie said. 18 months, Quirk said. Joint operation with the FBI. K-9 medical clearance fraud across 7 law enforcement agencies in 3 states. The clearances are being falsified at the contractor level. Apex K-9 Medical Services has been certifying animals as fit for active duty when internal records show flagged conditions. She put a folder on the counter. "We have the financial records. We have the pattern." A pause. "What we don't have is the origin point." Sadie looked at the folder. "What's in that?" "A whistleblower complaint filed 7 years ago," Quirk said, "by a Navy corpsman attached to a K-9 support unit out of Naval Station Rhoda. She documented 3 working dogs whose clearances didn't match the physical examinations she'd personally conducted." The agent's voice stayed even. "The complaint was reviewed, classified, and closed without action. The corpsman was administratively separated 14 months later on grounds that were later assessed internally as insufficient." Sadie set the paper towel she'd been holding down on the counter. The complaint had been 4 pages, single-spaced, with 24 pages of supporting documentation she'd attached in a manila envelope. She'd sealed herself because she hadn't trusted anyone else to seal it. She'd written it at 0200 in a supply room because it was the only space in the building without a working security camera. She'd filed it in triplicate and kept a copy, which she'd had sealed in a fireproof pouch inside a lockbox inside a closet in 4 different apartments across 3 cities since 2017. "You reopened it," she said. "We want to," Quirk said, "if you'll let us." She drove home the long way, through the part of Rosecrans Avenue where the bay went flat and orange in the late light if you timed the signals right. She drove through it without seeing it, because what she was actually seeing was a combination lock she hadn't opened in 4 years. The box was in the back of the bedroom closet, behind winter coats she never wore in San Diego but kept anyway, behind a fireproof sleeve with her lease and her discharge papers. It had a 4-digit combination she still knew by the muscle memory of the thumb and 3 fingers, which told her something about what the body held onto even when the mind had done its best to file it away. She stood in front of the closet for a while. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea she didn't particularly want, because some things you didn't decide in the first 30 seconds of standing in front of them, no matter how long you'd already been waiting. She thought about Grit, the way he'd pressed his nose against her hand, the way his body had been quietly failing for months while everyone with a title called it attitude. She thought about the tox panel, and what it meant that someone had gone to that kind of methodical pharmaceutical effort. Not to help a dog, but to keep him deployable past the point where his body had stopped being able to consent to it. She thought about 3 dogs whose names she still said to herself sometimes, not out loud, but in the specific internal way you said the names of things that mattered before you understood why. Axel Shepherd Cross, 4 years old, right shoulder cleared with a rotator tear-masked by anti-inflammatories for 9 weeks. Pinto Belgian Malinois, 6 years, both hips, deployed on clearances that hadn't matched any physical evaluation Sadie had ever seen in a legitimate file. Dune, Dutch Shepherd, 5 years old, cruciate ligament partially torn, managed pharmacologically for 11 weeks, deployed, put down in the field when the ligament finally gave during a search operation. The field report had called it an operational incident. She finished her tea, she washed the mug, she went back to the closet, set her fingers to the combination, and looked at what was inside. She hadn't destroyed it, because destroying it would have meant accepting that it hadn't mattered. She wasn't built that way. She'd tested whether she was, in the early years, and found out she wasn't, and eventually stopped testing. The box held printed records, 2 USB drives, a copy of the original complaint stamped received and then closed. No further action in red ink with a signature she'd memorized the same way she'd memorized the combination, and a digital voice recorder with the batteries removed, stored that way since 2017 so the contacts wouldn't corrode. She photographed every item with her phone before she touched anything. She'd learned that from a JAG officer she'd known briefly, who told her once that evidence stopped mattering most often because of how it was handled, not what it contained. She packed it carefully, set it by the door, and texted Quirk, "I kept records from 7 years ago. Come to me." The reply came back in under a minute. Address? Quirk arrived with a second agent named Terrell who stayed near the door and said almost nothing, which was the professional silence of someone doing a perimeter read. They sat at Sadie's kitchen table with the contents of the box spread between them while Sadie narrated each item in order, date, provenance, storage history. Quirk photographed everything. She listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who understood that people who were saying important things needed to finish saying them. When Sadie got to the recorder, she set it on the table between them. 3 weeks before I filed the complaint, she said, the contracting officer managing the K-9 clearance program at the time came to me informally. He told me that filing a report about falsified clearances would end my career and that no one in the command was going to back me. She looked at the recorder. I recorded that conversation. I'd been recording things that felt off since my second year in the unit. I didn't buy the recorder because I was planning anything. I bought it because I'd learned to. Quirk's hand went still above the tablet she'd been logging on. The contracting officer's name was Hutton Creel, Sadie said. At the time, he was a procurement officer attached to the unit. He now runs Apex K-9 Medical Services. He's held the federal clearance contract for 9 years. She kept her voice even. He got that contract 6 months after my complaint was buried. Quirk looked at her partner, a 2-second exchange that contained a full conversation. Mimsims. Collum, Quirk said, if that recording says what you're describing, it establishes that the suppression of your complaint was deliberate, that Creel had direct knowledge of the falsified clearances, and that the contracting scheme was built on a foundation that someone made sure couldn't be contested. She paused. You understand what that does to the scope of what we've been building. It means it started earlier than you thought, Sadie said, and it started because someone made sure the person who noticed it first couldn't say anything about it. She looked at the table. I'll give you everything, but I want the original complaint officially reopened as part of the evidentiary record, not a footnote, the record. Done, Quirk said. The first threat came at 11:17 that night, while Terrell was still logging the chain of custody documentation in Sadie's kitchen. A text from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. Some things are better off staying filed away. 3 minutes later, a call she let go to voicemail. She opened it and held the phone to her ear. The voice was flat, practiced, sanded down to the texture of something that had rehearsed itself into steadiness. She'd heard it once before, 7 years ago, in a hallway in a building at a naval station in Spain, and she'd heard it tell her that no one was going to listen to her and that she should think very carefully about what she was about to put on paper. This is a professional courtesy, Hutton Creel said. Whatever you think you're building, it won't hold the way you expect. Federal investigations of this scope take on their own gravity. The people who cooperate early think they're protected, and then they find out the window closed without them inside it. A pause, deliberate. I'm offering you the chance to reconsider before this becomes something none of us can undo. Think carefully about what you're protecting, because it's not going to protect you back. She saved the recording. She forwarded it to Quirk with one line. He called directly. Recording attached. Same voice, same cadence I documented in the 2009 file. Quirk's reply came back in under 3 minutes. Do not go anywhere tonight. We're sending Terrell back to your address. She read it twice. She put her phone face down on the table. She picked up the next document from the stack and kept working, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was always what they'd counted on her doing. The arrest happened at Palomar, which was not where Sadie had expected it to happen, and also, when she thought about it afterward, was exactly where it should have. Creel walked in on a Thursday afternoon alone, wearing a jacket that cost more than her monthly rent, with the expression of a man who had decided that direct was the only remaining option. He was older than she remembered, heavier in the face, with the particular softness of a decade spent behind a desk managing other people's risk instead of carrying his own. He found her at the intake counter without needing to look around, which told her something she filed away. Sadie, he said, like no time had passed, like they were colleagues at a conference who'd simply lost touch. She set her pen down. She did not stand. Mr. Creel. She reached under the counter and pressed the silent alert she'd installed herself 6 months ago, wired to her phone and Quirk's field number both. You drove a long way. I wanted to talk directly, he said, taking one step toward the desk. Without intermediaries, without all the… He gestured slightly, a small controlled movement, the noise. You called me 3 nights ago, she said. You texted me before that. You sent your legal representative to this facility the morning after. She held his gaze without moving. And now you're here in person. A pause. Every one of those decisions is going to be part of a federal record, Marcus. And you just walked into a building with a security camera at the entrance and 3 witnesses at the front counter. She let that sit. So I'll ask you to stay exactly where you are. Something moved behind his eyes. A quick inventory, exits, distances, what was in the way. Old habits in a man who'd spent his career thinking moves ahead. Then he settled, and the settling almost looked like dignity, which she supposed was the last thing a certain kind of person held on to when everything else started going. The front door opened behind him. Quirk came through first, Terrell 2 steps behind her. The expression on Creel's face in the half-second between recognition and reassembly was the first honest thing Sadie had seen from him in 7 years. It lasted just long enough to be real. Hutton Creel, Quirk said, reaching into her jacket. I have a warrant for your arrest. He complied slowly, with the deliberate cooperation of a man making sure every movement was documented as calm. Sadie had seen that before, the late-stage management of optics by a person who had already understood that optics were the only thing left. Bauer was at the end of the hallway. He'd been there for Grit's afternoon vitals check. He watched Creel being walked toward the door with his hands behind him, and he said nothing, which was more controlled than most people would have managed. Creel passed the counter on his way out. He didn't look at Sadie. She understood that choice. Looking at her would have required him to account for why she'd become the problem he hadn't been able to solve, and she didn't think he was capable of that particular arithmetic. Some people never arrived at it. The door swung shut. The lobby of Palomar Animal Emergency went very quiet. One of the receptionists said carefully, "Was that?" "Yes," Sadie said. She picked up her pen. "I need to finish this discharge summary." The call came 17 days later, at 6:20 in the evening, from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Then something about the timing made her pick up. The voice on the other end was older, steadied by the particular effort of someone who had spent years holding something and had decided today to put it somewhere it might finally be received. "Is this Sadie Collum?" the woman said, not quite a question. "It is. My name is Francis Odom. My son was Corporal Sean Odom. He was a K-9 handler with the Marines attached to a liaison unit. His dog was Dune." Sadie pulled to the side of the road. She had not cried about any of this yet. She'd moved through it the way she moved through most things that needed moving through. By keeping the next task in front of her and the weight behind her where she could carry it without losing her footing. But something about hearing Francis Odom say Dune in that particular voice, the voice of someone who'd been carrying that name for 7 years and had decided today to carry it somewhere it could be heard, that went through Sadie's operational stillness in a way she didn't have a defense against. She pressed her mouth flat for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that name means something to me. Sean talked about him like…" Francis stopped, started again. He said Dune wasn't right toward the end, before the deployment. He said something was off in how he moved, and they told him it was age. They told him Dune was just slowing down. A breath. The news story. About the dogs and the woman who filed a report they buried. "I've been calling people all afternoon." A pause. "I think you knew Dune." "I assessed him," Sadie said. "I documented what I found. I filed a report because what I found wasn't in his official file. Silence on the line. Was he in pain? Francis said, when they deployed him. Sadie closed her eyes for 1 second. I believe he was, yes. The sound Francis Odom made was small, controlled, and the shape of a grief being allowed, after 7 years, to take a different form. It lasted only a moment before she gathered it back. Thank you, Francis said, for not putting it down. Sadie sat on the shoulder of the road with the San Diego evening coming in around her, and she held the phone until Francis said goodbye. After she hung up, she sat for 4 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Grit's 12-week assessment fell on a Wednesday in early March, clear and cool, with the marine layer still burning off the water to the west. He walked into the exterior courtyard under his own power, the repaired lumbar region carrying his weight in a way it hadn't been able to since long before he'd come through Palomar's doors. When Bauer crouched at the far end of the courtyard and held out his hand, Grit crossed the distance at a steady trot, not the explosive bolt of a young dog, but even and uncompensated and entirely his own. Bauer put both hands on the dog's face and held him there for a long moment. Neither of them moved. Sadie watched from the courtyard doorway with her coffee going cold in her hand. Her phone buzzed. Quirk. Sentencing came down this morning. Creel, 14 years. 2 co-defendants accepted plea agreements. The clearance program is under federal suspension pending full audit. The U.S. Attorney's Office formally recognized your 2009 complaint as a valid whistleblower report, improperly suppressed at the command level. It's in the official record. She read it twice. She thought about what it meant that a thing could be in the official record. Finally, after 7 years of being the person who'd been right in the wrong place at the wrong time and had kept the evidence anyway because she couldn't figure out how to stop. She thought about Axel and Pinto and Dune. She thought about Dune especially, 5 years old, deployed on a joint that had been managed into the appearance of health, and the field report that had called what happened to him an operational incident because that was easier than the alternative. She thought about Francis Odom and the particular sound of a grief being allowed to change shape. She texted Quirk back, understood, thank you. She put the phone away. In the courtyard, Bauer stood and threw a training bumper in a low arc across the morning air. Grit went after it without hesitation, not the overdrive of a dog proving something, but the clean, unhurried movement of an animal that had learned, at some cost, to trust what its body told it again. He caught it, turned, brought it back. Bauer caught it and looked up and found Sadie in the doorway. He's good, Bauer said. He's good, she said. She finished her coffee. She went back inside. She had intake cases waiting, a post-op that needed discharge notes, and a stack of charting she'd been behind on since morning. There was a cat in Bay 2 that had not consented to her attention being elsewhere, and that was a form of fairness she'd always been able to maintain, regardless of what else was happening in the world around it. She picked up her pen and got to work.